A lot of fans are in denial about the politics of Star Wars and most fantasy. Unfortunately, a lot of fans are also in deeper denial about the politics of Firefly and the movie Serenity, which is absolutely depicting and criticizing the idea of a liberal authoritarian regime. Now, a lot of you are already throwing various vegetables and food at the screen for, any number of reasons. Maybe some of you are shouting about how authoritarianism is inherently conservative. I'm not here today to dive into the debate on whether it's possible to have liberal authoritarianism. That could be a separate video. If you want to hear about it, I will do the work. It'll take a little while because that's not really my area of expertise, but I can, do my best to get a crash course on that the debate of that and weigh in on my opinion. Get in the comments if you want to hear about that. No, today I'm here to point out that this show, the point of view of the show and its main characters, especially Mal and Zoe and any other members of the Resistance, are definitely putting forth the point of view that people in power within the universe of Firefly are oppressing them. But what little, details we get about the political foundation of those in power are not cleanly based in conservatism the way that most authoritarianism is represented in fantasy. Well, actually, to be honest, most fantasy doesn't actually give enough political foundation to the people in power to actually root it in any sort of useful or meaningful critique of society or any political actual ideology. Yeah, it's not really rooted in any actual ideology, so it's quite toothless. It's actually rarely criticizing anything at all. But in Firefly, this is states' rights propaganda. It's Confederate fan fiction. It literally valorizes people who believe the Civil War was about freedom from Northern aggression. Okay. I'm Sanders, and we're figuring it out. I've been thinking about this for at least a decade. The cast started teasing some big announcement a week ago, so I did some preliminary research, and I got immediately tired because it just gets worse the more you look into it. So today I'm just going to do a quick SparkNotes version, and if this video gets a lot of traction, I'll do a more thorough analysis, including a proper summary of what the show is, get into, the behind-the-scenes context. I'm going to rewatch the entire show and the movie. I'll probably try to get my hands on the comics, and I'll take a look, at my updated experience 20 years after its original release. I'll read, any article I find from other people who are talking about it. You get the picture. I'll do the deep dive, and I'll come back here with all of my receipts. But for now, I was a massive Firefly fan. I was a huge Joss Whedon fan growing up. My family, we loved Buffy and Angel, though I rarely got to watch it due to my bedtime. I watched it when I became an adult. But, I loved Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. I loved Cabin in the Woods. And just to illustrate how much, how dedicated we have to be, we really had to fight to watch Firefly. It aired between September to December of 2002. So I think I was just starting middle school. And only 11 of the episodes aired. They were out of order. If I'm remembering correctly, they kept changing the day and time when it would air. So we had to chase it down to make sure we got to see what little was released. And, I remember in high school, I had a friend tell me that this show was basically taking the point of view of Confederate soldiers. I read an article that was talking about how Firefly's feminism was trash, and I completely wrote off all of this at the time because I loved this show. It was so fun, the chemistry of the cast was undeniable. The representation of Wynn was very novel. And I mean, rarely have I felt more seen than the first time I watched Community and they, Troy and Abed talked about Firefly and all the jokes that are embedded there. And then I grew up, right? And more stories kept coming to my attention about how much working with Joss Whedon was a humiliation ritual. And, you know, really started to look like the women he was writing was more fetish than, you know, good faith writing. And I started realizing that the core morality of his projects are like pretty conservative, centrist at best, but honestly kind of boring and repetitive. So I started to wonder, you know, like how much of what I liked from his work was actually from him specifically. Other creators have done deep dives into Joss, into Buffy, Dollhouse, both the work and the behind the scenes. I'll try to grab some and include them in the description. I'll definitely come back to those if I do a more thorough overview. But when you look at his work, right, when you zoom out to look at his work to try and find like trends and take some cues of like maybe what he might have meant in one thing or another, sure, he writes nuanced women, but they're always somehow obsessed with or like running their lives around some mid or outright abusive man. And the show is usually punishing or humbling them like on repeat. And then furthermore, like Joss has got like maybe 3-ish ideas, right? Like go back and watch Alien Resurrection, which he wrote. There's like a whole, there's a crew in that story that is clearly a rough draft for Firefly. The Buffy the show was first Buffy the movie. Cabin in the Woods ends with a government conspiracy that's featured in what I consider the worst season of Buffy. Literally everything he's ever done, he kills off a nice character that everybody loves. And above all else, if you are talking, you should be making or setting up a joke. Yeah, we can thank Joss for the fact that there's just like one tone to all action movies right now. It feels like there's like very little variety, which, listen, we all liked his voice, we all liked the shtick, but like we've seen it enough times. I think we can handle a little bit more variety. Before I get into the next portion, I do want to preface the rest of a video with a disclaimer. I just finished criticizing Joss. One of the many lenses through which I analyze anything, but in this case Firefly, is by zooming out to the larger body of work, right, of the creators. But that doesn't mean that every criticism of Joss applies to Firefly, and not every criticism of Firefly applies to Joss, right? A piece of criticism doesn't have to be true of every person involved in its creation for the critique to be valid. So, with that in mind, this show is low-key racist, and I'm not even talking about the Civil War in space part. The show is set in a future where Chinese and U.S. culture were the predominant ones shaping human culture when they started living in space. And I will absolutely defer to the Asian diaspora, but to my outsider eye, I think that this could have been really cool. But since it's botched, we just end up with the same thing that that a lot of American stuff does, which is appropriating aesthetics and culture from a group that white Americans are less familiar with, excluding the members of that group who made that culture, and then get the label of like unique or original because the audience isn't used to seeing it. Right? So like in the case of Firefly, we see countless references to Asian culture throughout the series. Not a single significant character is played by an Asian actor. What few Asian actors we do see are extras and a prostitute. And sex work is valid work. I'm going to talk more about that, but the issue is that like the roles that are allotted to Asian actors are so rare, and they're, they deserve more. They deserve more nuanced stories. They shouldn't be relegated to, almost no lines in this show, and certainly, no major arcs, barely any screen time. And Mandarin is incorporated into the show, which again could have been cool, but apparently it is horribly pronounced, and it's typically only used when the characters are mad. Like they use curse words and then small rants when they're mad, which doesn't make sense to me because that's a thing that people do when they're speaking their second language. When people who are bilingual are mad and they're speaking their second language, they sometimes they're so worked up that they can't do the translation in their head, or like they struggle to think in the second language, so they drop back down into their first language, which in Firefly, all of the characters speak English like 99% of the time with correct pronunciation, and as we already said, they're butchering the Mandarin that they do say, so I think it's fair to say that English is their first language. So why would they drop out of their first language, right? Why would they be going through the extra effort to think or translate to their second language when they're upset? That, and listen, bilingual, multilingual people, polyglots, get in the comments if I'm wrong about this, if I'm fundamentally misunderstanding something here, but to me that seemed very strange. And like on this topic of Asian culture, I think it's very important that we listen to people from that actual demographic. So I've already found some links talking about this, so please go read and watch what they have to say. Moving on, this show and Joss Whedon himself get lauded repeatedly for feminism. And I used to, and a lot of fans still do, easily dismiss criticism of Firefly's portrayal of women for a few reasons. I think the most obvious one is that a lot of the analysis, or quote-unquote analysis, that I see talking about the feminism of Firefly is not very good. They kind of just stop at somebody called someone a whore, which, sure, but that's really easily refuted when you watch the show, and it's like very clear that the show's point of view is that man was wrong to call that woman a whore. And so I'm gonna put a pin in this, and I'm gonna come back. The second reason that I think a lot of people struggle to engage with the criticism of the feminism is that there's some basic fundamentals of analysis that a lot of people still need to develop, and the key one here is that you can't use the piece of art to justify itself, because that's circular logic. It's kind of like the equivalent of saying like, I'm right because I said so. That's not good argumentation. It's not persuasive, right? The way that I learned this concept is that I had an art class. We had an assignment to make a painting that captures the essence of a film or a story. One dude chose the film Showgirls. I'm not going to talk about that show. That movie. Go look it up if you don't know what I'm talking about. Fuck that movie. So he chose Showgirls. He painted a small, maybe 10 by 10 inch pop art style breast, zoomed in on the nipple. So obviously several women in the class were going around and around with him, trying to explain that at best this was very obnoxious, but really it reduces women down to sexual objects. And he kept defending himself by arguing that the painting was an accurate representation of the film, because the film reduces a woman down to a sexual object. And finally, one of the women broke through all the noise just to yell at him like, "You chose the film." So what we can take from this is that, like, when we make art, we make the decisions about what the subject is and how it's presented. This is true of every medium and genre, including documentaries. You cannot 100% remove the artist's bias and point of view, and you can't use the logic, plot, or lore of the art to justify decisions that the artist made. They chose to write the logic, plot, and lore the way that it is, ergo, they could have written it differently. So when you look at a character like Zoe and say, well, she's so loyal to Mal because they're war buddies. If you look at Mal giving Kaylee the chance to follow her dreams, or Mal giving River a safe space, Anara wanting to, or clearly having feelings for Mal because, they don't really give a reason for her to have feelings for Mal. We're just supposed to accept that because either you find him charming or you don't. And really, that's the point, right? Anara wants to bone Mal because Joss Whedon said so. He didn't have to write it so that every woman on this ship is weirdly orbiting around this man. You could literally turn this into a dating game without changing anything. Now that that little anecdote is out of the way, let's go back to the first reason. The reason most of us are aware of. Most people haven't done a good job of unpacking this warped feminism of Joss Whedon's work, and they have especially failed in regards to Firefly. I'm going to try and link in the description some stuff that does critique the feminism well, but here are some highlights. I need to rewatch the whole show to like have my opinion about this determined, but what I'm seeing from people is that Firefly and Serenity rarely, if ever, pass the Bechdel test. And that test is not the end-all be-all of whether a project has good representation or even if the project is good, but I would say that this would be very alarming to me if it's true, considering how many women are significant characters on the show. Like, if you have that many characters that like are like so badass and like so intelligent, they really can't have many, if they don't have that many scenes where they're like talking to each other, not about men, like they're talking about something of like, you know, significance, that's very alarming. For context, I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Buffy does typically pass the Bechdel test, or at the very least, if the two women are still talking about men regularly, it's usually like the villain or plot of the episode, not like some interpersonal drama. Another accusation that I need to keep an eye out for on rewatch is that some people are saying that none or few of the characters, especially the women, have clear motivations and storylines, which, like, this is not a slice of life show. This is very much like plot driven. And so if Mal is the only character with an actual plot, that's a problem. And, you know, I hear you that the show only had a half season, so it's absolutely possible that this would have improved. Looking at Buffy again, it took a few seasons to Willow to really have her own character arc. But also, like, Xander never actually got one. And I heard a rumor that the plan was to have Mal have some character growth in, like, for example, realizing he's wrong about Inara's work, which is great. But that the way they were going to do that was because Inara was going to get gang raped by Reavers. So, you know, 10 steps back. And I absolutely have added this to the list of things that I need to verify if I do a full video. So tell me if that's important for you to find out too in the comments. One of the things that I see most people complaining about, and this is where, like, I think the analysis is too shallow, is that they're complaining that men are always calling women whores, telling them they're not girly enough, telling them they're too girly, hitting them, you know, punching them. And for those of you who are still like having a knee-jerk reaction of like, well, yeah, like the men in those scene are bad, they're wrong to do that, or like the woman getting punched is like a badass fighter who can take a punch, or this character is morally gray and like that's what's interesting about it. These are all different examples of using the text to justify itself. So take a step back with me. The show is intentionally written so that it makes sense for these things to happen in context. And this was a rampant issue in shows during like the aughts. Somebody does something shitty, someone in the scene points out it's shitty, and then nothing really happens. Because it's just a loophole, y'all. It's just a loophole. Like, the writers wanted to do this shitty thing, and they found a goddamn loophole. And like by now, most of us have caught on to this, and it's not really as common anymore. We want to see that. We want to see stuff where people aren't doing super shitty stuff, or something like meaningful happens as a result of like the bigoted thing happening, right? We certainly don't want it to just be this constant stream of bad behavior from characters that we're supposed to care about, that we're supposed to love and root for. Jane's number one function in the story is to be the worst. And obviously that's played for comedic relief. But like what I need us all to recognize is that it's not just for comedic relief. It's also to make it less obvious that Mal's awful, because in comparison, Mal seems like a dream. When you put him up against Jane, when you put him up against like most of the other men in the show, most of the characters in general, Mal, you know, it starts to feel a whole lot like sure, Mal does this, Mal does that, but it could be worse, right? And it could be worse is a huge cornerstone of American culture. It's definitely like my entire mentality about my position in life until maybe a decade ago, right? And I'm not laying this like solely at the feet of Firefly. That's not my point. My point is that like this is not this is an issue that we see in a lot of different works, and it's showing up here in Firefly as well. And considering the fact that Mal, does so many shitty things, and the show is heavily reliant on you finding him charming in spite of that, and you've got so many other characters whose like primary or secondary function is to make Mal look less terrible than he is. It begs the question, why is everyone obsessed with and or following Mal around like a puppy? Why is everyone so loyal to him? When I was younger, I loved Mal. I found him very charming. We'll see if that's true on rewatch. So I get it. I really do. But he is so fucking shitty to everyone. In Buffy, it's way more obvious that it's weird because Xander is so terrible. He contributes virtually nothing, doesn't grow as a character, and despite the fact that he barely likes them, Willow, Cordelia, and Anya are all madly in love with him at some point, right? Buffy, who is way more mature, way better informed, and should not ever listen to Xander's opinion about anything, repeatedly defers to his opinion. And this is especially infuriating when there's certain points in that show when he is so fucking patronizing, and the show is yeah, Xander's right, and Buffy needs to get her head out of her ass and listen to what he has to say, which is insane. So in Buffy, it's way more obvious as an adult watching that show that that's crazy. Whereas with Mal, he is competent, right? He's the captain of the crew, and he does lead them out of a lot of really tough spots. And I would argue that his personality is more widely considered charming. So it's a lot easier to gloss over the fact that this is weird, that this dynamic is weird, that he has all these women who are low-key obsessed with him. So why does it feel feminist? It kind of is, right? So don't get mad. I know I just said a whole lot of shit, and now I'm backtracking because, listen, there are multiple women who are predominant characters. They're all distinct in personality. They have strengths and flaws. The love of the show destigmatizes sex work, kinda. It is sex positive, kinda. They're all attractive in different ways. Some of them are overtly sexy, which is absolutely allowed. Everyone is generally wearing actual clothes that match their day-to-day life. There's even a little bit of queer representation, not the greatest, but they're not super reliant on men. They have lots of screen time. They save each other. They save the male characters. They talk like humans. Well, they talk like Joss Whedon, but that's how everyone talks in Joss Whedon projects. So they're written with equal care to the male characters, which, spoiler alert for my potential part 2 video, the male characters aren't given as much care as you think. And, we also have to take a moment to remember when this show came out. This was truly unprecedented, right? To have so many women. I mean, even today, it's rare to have so many predominant women in a show that's targeting a male audience. So this is not a cut and dry example of bad female representation. There's a lot to like here. I would actually compare Firefly to something like Terminator or Alien. When those came out, especially Terminator 2 and Alien, they were a genuine step forward in that it put a woman in a role she would not have been able to have prior, right? But since then, we've realized that there's still a lot of room for improvement. We don't have to settle for, I wrote a man but cast a woman. So Firefly is a step up from Terminator, since we have a variety of different women. But when you bullet out the facts about those characters, you realize that they're just tropes we've seen a zillion times, especially in things like dating games. So don't get me wrong, it's enjoyable. And there's nothing wrong with using more archetypal characters in a plot-driven story, but it's just not the end-all be-all of what we should be aspiring to, right? We should demand more. It was an incremental improvement that we have already surpassed. And when you zoom out on Joss's career, I start to feel a little queasy because this is getting into fetish territory. It's not as egregious, but I think it is worth comparing to Tarantino, who is another That's another asshole I can do a video about if y'all get in the goddamn comments. So, the clickbait topic that I got you all here. States' rights. This is brown coat propaganda. As I said, a friend literally told me in high school that they're the brown coats, and I argued to the teeth that he was wrong. But Joss Whedon himself said that the American Civil War was the direct inspiration, which means that Zoe and Mal are Confederate soldiers. Despite presenting as someone who is liberal, atheist, and feminist in interviews, Whedon's shows have a pretty conservative streak. Firefly, which he says is the most opposite his worldview, I need to look into what he could possibly mean by that. That show is blatantly libertarian, which I would argue is centrist at best, because I think it's not a coincidence that libertarianism is most popular with cishet white dudes, typically in high school and college. In Firefly, there's a whole ass character whose primary role in the show is herding Mal to Christianity like a goddamn German Shepherd. On Buffy, Whedon was really pissed that characters like Spike were kept on the show and given arcs. He wanted to keep the morality very black and white. I might be misremembering, but I'm pretty sure I remember him talking about that, like, vampires should just be like an allegory for sexual, like, corruption. And this, like, if you take out the explorations of themes and morality that we get from characters like Spike, you're just left with a creature feature. It's literally the least interesting approach to the genre. So in Firefly, he's like, well, I removed the slavery bit. And, like, what the hell is the war about then? Like, for anyone unaware, states' rights was the rationalization. It was not the reason for the war. It was the dog whistle, like, that's the way that they sold it to poor white people, who were doing the actual dying for the war. In reality, the war was to maintain their economic strategy of slavery. Famously, poor whites did not have slaves and struggled for fair wages, considering the, quote unquote competition was free. So if you remove slavery without replacing it with some reason for the war, we're literally just reskinning the propaganda, the fantasy that is still taught in many schools in the South to this day, right? The fantasy that the South wasn't fighting to keep slavery. No, they were fighting to protect themselves from Northern aggression, which is just great, right? And furthermore, like, in the show, if we don't have slavery, if we're not getting into any, like, true ideology, all that we're really seeing from the people in power is, like, they're regulating things to hell and back and, like, doing scientific experiments that go really bad. And so what they're really talking about is corruption. They're conflating large government with corruption. So notice how the issues in the show are things that come up just as often in private companies and or when private interests have a foothold in the government. The libertarian big government bad point of view relies on the assumption that corruption and harm will be reduced if everything is left to smaller groups of people, like local government or private interest. It assumes that there will always be someone like Mal to swoop in and stop them if something bad happens, right? If the smaller companies, smaller governments decide to collude together, if they get corrupted and they start bullying and oppressing people, well, it's not a problem because someone like Mal will come and save us, right? Which, like, listen, I think community is the way forward. Buy local. Totes. You're just not going to convince me that corruption only happens at the federal level and with government. You're not going to convince me that regulation is the primary issue. Corruption and authoritarianism can happen at any scale, regardless of whether there is or is not regulation. And you're going to hear me say this a lot, but American culture really wants everything to be solved by firefighters. I want more fire inspectors. In other words, we should be putting more of our resources into decreasing the frequency of fires rather than putting all of our resources into putting them out after they've started. Obviously, we need to have firefighters, but if we are putting more resources into preventing them to begin with, then we prevent damage, we prevent injury, we prevent death, right? Like, we should be trying to avoid them, not putting all of our eggs into putting them out later. So, yay, regulation. It reduces corruption and, E. coli and measles outbreaks. If you want a more detailed explanation on regulation, you know what to do. Finally, the South will rise again. Unlike Buffy, which had enough seasons and a comic book to get as messy as possible. Firefly was canceled literally before it was filmed. It only got a half season in a movie, which, considering it's genuinely, a lot of fun, that made for a rabid fan base, which also ties in really nicely with the Confederate fan fiction of it all. When you look at Whedon's other work, however, it's really clear that he never really improved his editing. Like, Dr. Horrible and Cabin in the Woods are probably the cleanest executed of his work, while still being, like, reasonably unique. But it's also, like, really unclear how much of the best parts of his shows were from Joss specifically versus someone else, right? Like, see my previous comments about what he wanted Buffy to be, and also the fact that Dolly Parton's company, Sand Dollar Productions, produced Buffy. When you think about like this, when you think about these details, you can't just dismiss the issues of Firefly the way that we can dismiss the issues of like Alien Resurrection, which is kind of like feels more like rough draft, right? Or and you also like, or the same way that we can kind of like ignore Buffy the movie because things got more interesting in the show. We can't just like assume that that's the case with Firefly, because given more seasons and a different production team, it's highly likely that it would have become just as messy, right? It probably would have had just as many issues. And considering all of the racist and sexist issues already in the show, I think it's really naive to assume that it would have just gotten so much better if they had continued at the time. And, on Sunday, we got the announcement that they're trying to put together an animated project for Firefly. Unclear when exactly it's going to take place. Maybe they said it and I missed it. But like where in the timeline it is, I'm not sure. But, thinking about the issues I've outlined here, can we really be surprised that now is the time that they're really trying to push a new installment of Firefly? I hear that a lot of this was like, behind the scenes, like logistics and like legal issues. I do hear that. Don't get me wrong. But like, part of the reason I'm sure that some of that stuff has freed up is because of the monopolies being formed within the entertainment industry, right? And it's also, we're smack dab in the middle of a period when people are asking really heavy-hitting questions like, what if Robin Hood was evil, actually? And everyone loves an underdog story. Most people, have Firefly on this pedestal in their head. And so I think... I think I have to be honest when I say that Firefly, the only time Firefly could have a comeback is when everything's on fucking fire. Anyway, if you want yeehaw in space, go watch Cowboy Bebop. It's not like, I'm not claiming it's any bastion of any kind of like progressivism or female representation, but it does have an actual thing to say, and it's executed really well. So yeah, that's enough of that. By the way, like I said before, if you want me to do a follow-up to this, I will absolutely do that work, but it's going to be a lot of work, right? Like, I want to do it properly. I've had this idea to talk about this for a long, long time, and I want to do it justice. I wanted to get out and say something quickly because I had a lot of feelings about the discourse that I was seeing amongst fans at the announcement, and the fact that while I've seen murmurings here and there of different people trying to talk about the issues with this show, I think it really feels like I'm not the only one who's been avoiding talking about it, and someone's got to break the seal. We have to think about this. We have to contend with this. I think it's really wild to see how many people are like talking about how this is some super feminist text, and then we've got all these fans lamenting the fact that Firefly is going to go woke and that it's going to be ruined because it's going to go woke, which is an insane dichotomy to have in a fan base. And it's especially insane when you actually go back and watch the project. So, yeah. I'm excited. But I'm not going to do that work unless you guys actually make it worth my time. So, tell me. Bye.